All right, let's dive right into this. Today, we're unpacking a story that is literally nearly 3,000 years old. But in this explainer of the source material, we are definitely not going to treat it like some dusty, boring myth you had to read in high school. What we're actually looking at is a thrilling, frankly unbelievable disaster caused entirely by one man's massive ego right after winning the Trojan War.
So, to set the stage here, the Greeks had been camped outside the walls of Troy for 10 long years. They just couldn't get in. But our main guy, Odysseus, he has this absolute genius idea. You know it. Build a giant wooden horse, hide your best soldiers inside, and leave it as a gift. The Trojans drag it in. The Greeks climb out at night, burn the city to the ground, and boom, the war is over. Odysseus is an absolute hero. And after that brilliant victory, all he had to do was sail back to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus on the island of Ithaca. It was a trip that, realistically, should have taken about 2 weeks. Tops.
But it didn't. That quick 2-week victory lap, it actually turned into a grueling 10-year nightmare. A decade filled with shipwrecks, incredibly angry gods, and just absolute, utter chaos at every turn.
And we really need to understand the tragic stakes at the start of this journey, because they cannot be overstated. Odysseus left Troy with a massive fleet. We're talking 12 ships and over 600 men. Think about that for a second. Over 600 hardened veterans of the Trojan War setting sail for home. And, well, spoiler alert for the rest of this explainer, not a single one of those crew members made it back.
Part 1. The mistake that ruined everything. So, how exactly does a brilliant tactician manage to lose 600 men? It all starts when Odysseus and his crew are exploring an island and end up trapped in a cave by a man-eating one-eyed giant named Polyphemus.
Now, this giant, who just so happens to be a son of the sea god Poseidon, seals the cave door with a boulder so heavy that 22 wagons couldn't budge it. And then, he immediately smashes 2 men's heads on the ground and eats them raw. So, Odysseus can't just kill him in his sleep, right? Because if he does, no one is moving that boulder and they all starve. So he uses his brain. He gets the giant incredibly drunk on this incredibly strong wine. And when the giant asks his name, Odysseus casually says, "Oh, my name is Nobody." Once the giant passes out, Odysseus blinds him with a heated, sharpened olive stake. And here's the genius part. When Polyphemus screams for help from the other Cyclopes outside, they ask who's hurting him. He yells, "Nobody is hurting me." So they just tell him to keep it down and go back to sleep. Absolute brilliance. They manage to escape the next morning by strapping themselves underneath the bellies of the giant's sheep.
But look at this unbelievable contrast. I mean, if Odysseus had just sailed away right then, Poseidon would have never known who blinded his son. They were home free. But Odysseus was just too proud. He's safely pulling away on his ship, and his fragile ego completely takes over. He actually stands up and shouts his real name, his father's name, and his literal address in Ithaca back at the giant. He just had to have the credit. And because he gave Polyphemus his actual name, the giant prayed to his father Poseidon to curse the journey. And you better believe Poseidon heard every single word.
Which brings us to Part 2, Monsters, Witches, and Bad Winds. Because from that exact moment forward, the sea itself became Odysseus's worst enemy. Welcome to the Gauntlet. First up is a tragedy of just epic proportions. The King of the Winds actually really liked Odysseus, so he did him a solid. He put all the dangerous, storm-causing winds into a leather bag and gave him a gentle breeze to carry them straight home. For 9 days, it's perfect sailing. On the 10th day, Ithaca literally appears on the horizon. Odysseus can actually see the smoke rising from his own island's chimneys. But then, he falls asleep. His crew, who are convinced he's secretly hoarding gold in that bag, decide to open it, and every trapped wind explodes out at once, blowing all 12 ships entirely across the sea, further away than ever before.
And that one terrible mistake leads them right into a harbor surrounded by steep cliffs, which, unfortunately, happens to be home to the Lastrygonians. They're a race of literal giants. These giants start hurling massive boulders down from the cliffs, smashing the ships to splinters, and spearing the crews like fish. The terrifying math here is that Odysseus only escaped because he happened to park his specific ship outside the harbor. 12 ships instantly became just one. Over 500 men were reduced to a mere few dozen. And remember, they weren't even halfway home yet.
From there, the relentless horrors just frantically compound. They wash up on an island where the witch Circe turns his men into literal pigs. I'm talking snouts, hooves, the whole shebang. They end up stuck there for a whole year. Then they have to sail to the actual edge of the world, down to the land of the dead, where Odysseus sees his own mother. She had died of grief just waiting for him to come back. He tries to hug her 3 times, but she just slips through his arms like a shadow. It's heartbreaking, but they have to keep moving. They navigate the sirens by plugging the crew's ears with beeswax, followed immediately by Scylla, a terrifying six-headed monster. And here's the dark reality of his leadership. Odysseus actively chooses to sail near Scylla to avoid a massive whirlpool, intentionally sacrificing 6 screaming sailors who are eaten alive just so the rest of the ship can survive.
But the crew ultimately seals their own fate at Thrinacia. They were specifically, explicitly warned not to touch the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. But bad winds trap them on the island for a month. The food completely runs out, and once again, Odysseus falls asleep. The starving crew decides they'd rather face the wrath of the gods than slowly starve on a beach, so they slaughter the cattle. When Odysseus finally wakes up, he smells roasting beef and just knows it's over. And in this darkly hilarious yet totally terrifying twist, the hides of the dead cattle start crawling on the ground, and the meat on the roasting spits physically moos. Yeah, you heard that right. The meat mooed.
The very moment they set sail, the gods retaliate. Zeus splits their last remaining ship right in half with a massive thunderbolt. Every single man drowns, leaving us with a final, devastating count of 1. Just one single man, Odysseus, left clinging to the wreckage in the middle of the ocean.
Part 3, Revenge of the Beggar King. After that, Odysseus is forced to stay with the nymph goddess Calypso for 7 long years, until he finally washes up on the shores of Ithaca. It's been 20 years since he originally left for Troy, and what does he find? His home is in ruins, and 108 arrogant suitors have moved in, eating his food and endlessly harassing his wife Penelope to marry one of them.
Now you might be wondering, how on earth did Penelope survive this invasion for so long? Well, she employed one of the most ingenious stalling tactics in history. She told these 108 aggressive men that she would choose a husband, but only after she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's aging father. So, step 1, she wove the shroud all day long in plain sight of everyone. But step 2, every single night she secretly unraveled all her work. She actually kept this brilliant trick up for 3 entire years before one of her own servants gave her away.
Okay, so to get back into his own house safely, the goddess Athena disguises Odysseus as an old, withered beggar. And the emotional toll here is just heavy. As he walks up to the estate, his ancient hunting dog, Argos, a dog he raised 20 years ago, recognizes him through the disguise, wags his tail, and immediately dies. He literally just held on for 2 decades to see his master one last time. Inside, the suitors treat the disguise king like absolute garbage, even throwing a heavy footstool at his head. He just takes it, watching, planning. Finally, Penelope announces a contest. Whoever can string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through 12 axe heads wins her hand. Well, none of the 108 suitors can even bend the bow. Then, the beggar steps up, effortlessly strings it, fires the arrow clean through all 12 axes, and then turns the weapon on the suitors. It's an absolute bloodbath, as he and his son slaughter all 108 of them.
But when the dust settles, we're left with a massive question. How do you actually prove who you are after 20 years? Penelope isn't totally convinced yet. I mean, it's been 2 decades, and this stranger just violently killed over 100 people in her dining room. She needs a final, brilliant test to make absolutely sure this dangerous man is truly her long-lost husband.
And this moment brilliantly illustrates Penelope's own strategic genius. She casually tells her servants, "Oh, just move the king's bed out of the master bedroom for our guest." Odysseus immediately snaps. He shouts that the bed absolutely cannot be moved because he built it himself, carving the bedpost out of a living olive tree that is still rooted in the ground. Nobody in the world knew that secret except the 2 of them. It was the one, very specific, frustrated outburst that only the real Odysseus could possibly have. She breaks down, and after 20 long years of misery, they are finally reunited.
Part 4, The Cost of an Ego. We really have to look back at everything we just went through and ask why this source material has remained so profoundly relevant since the 8th century BC.
And here is the core takeaway. Odysseus outsmarted a man-eating Cyclops. He resisted the literal mind control of the sirens, and he successfully navigated the actual land of the dead. He was widely known as the smartest man in ancient Greece. And yet, the smartest person in the room can still be the dumbest person in the room if they can't control their own pride. If Odysseus had just checked his ego and not shouted his name at that blinded giant, he could have saved 600 lives and avoided a decade of unimaginable pain. So the question I want to leave you with today is this. In your own life, when might your desperate need for credit be setting you up for your own 10-year shipwreck? Because as this 3,000-year-old epic proves, sometimes the absolute smartest move you can make is just keeping your mouth shut.